Thank you, Dominic. I think Dominic and Bill have given us the challenge ahead of us for the next day and a half, and so it's going to be a lot of good listening and hopefully good dialogue that will happen over the course of these next 2 days. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Etienne Wenger from California. He is a world expert in communities of practice, and this is a term that you're going to hear a lot of over the next day and a half. He was a pioneer in communities of practice research and is now recognized as a global leader in that field. He's much sought after as being a speaker and a workshop leader, and we're so pleased that he could be here today. He's written several books on communities of practice, and Dominic has shown you one. I guess the first one was Communities of Practice, Learning, Meaning, and Identity. So I won't say too much more because I really want to hear Etienne speak. So Etienne, please give your presentation.
Yep. The concept of community of practice was coined out of a cross-boundary collaboration. And so it's kind of interesting that the concept was born in a context that concept itself would be good to explain. And it was in the context of a research institute that had been started by the Xerox Foundation in response to a report by the Department of Education in the US, and the title of this report was A Nation at Risk. So you can imagine what a report by the Department of Education says about US education when the title is A Nation at Risk. And the idea of that institute was that schools of education were going to do some research on classroom techniques and so on and so forth, but that someone should really take a good look at learning. Learning itself, our assumptions about learning, and how that influenced the way that we organized context for people to learn in. And at the time, I would say that learning was owned mostly by sort of cognitive psychology, a little bit by artificial intelligence. But anyway, the idea of John Seeley Brown, the person who started that institute, was that learning could not be owned by any discipline and that they should bring disciplines together. So we brought disciplines together, and I came from artificial intelligence. You had psychologists, you have anthropologists, linguists, educators, and some subject matter people, math educators, physics educators, language educators, and so on and so forth. And those people were brought together with the charter of rethinking learning. And what was interesting is that the first 9 months of this institute was basically a bunch of fights. It was basically a bunch of fights between these disciplines that didn't trust each other's methodologies, didn't trust each other's intentions, didn't trust each other's view of the topic, and so on and so forth. You can imagine sort of a computer scientist and an anthropologist talking about learning. It's just, well, actually, also another thing that was interesting, and actually that's something that I hope that we were going to talk about in this workshop, is that the question of what is learning pretty quickly came down to what assumptions are you making about who is a learner? What assumption are you making about issues? That's why the last word in the subtitle of my book was identity. What assumptions are you making about the person who is doing the learning? And of course, for a computer scientist, the assumption is that a learner is an information processor. You present the right set of data, and the learner is going to build the information structure to account for the data. And for an anthropologist, a learner is a member of a social system of meaning. And so you can imagine the kind of conversation that were going on at the beginning of this institute between a computer scientist who would turn to the anthropologist and say, "Oh, listen, your nice little book about your island is nice literature, but really it's not science. It's kind of, you describe things, but you don't explain anything. And so, if you're part of a research institute and you're told what you're doing is not science, you feel hurt, and so you respond in kind by saying, but your little program that is supposed to model the behavior of students on subtraction problem is probably good computer science because it's probably hard programming, but really it's irrelevant to the topic here. Because because there is nobody doing the learning. It's just a set of information structures. And so, what does it tell us about the reality of a human being who is trying to learn subtraction in a school? So this was the kind of boundary crossing conversations. And one thing that really helped, now if we think about what made it actually a successful sort of innovative context, one thing that really helped was that there was this identity with the concept of learning. That these people agreed that learning was too big for any of their discipline to own, and because of that were willing to go through the pain sometimes of talking with people with whom normally they would not talk. They would not waste their time. As an anthropologist, you would want to waste your time with this stupid computer scientist who doesn't understand anything about what you're doing, and vice versa. You see what I mean? So what I'm saying is that we all often talk about boundary crossing and connecting communities, but unless you have a good reason, it's not efficient for your life and for your time and for who you are to go spend all this time with these people who don't understand what you're trying to do, who don't appreciate it, and so on and so forth. So having that identity with respect to learning really held this institute, and of course then having an institute, having a context where you were not putting your career at risk by wasting that time, where it was viewed as an institutional purpose, also really helped. So another thing that actually also helped, that's one thing that actually I'm not sure that other members of the institute would tell the story that way, but it was to have people like me. I was a graduate student at the time. I was invited to join that institute because of work that I had done in artificial intelligence. And offer you can't refuse. Seeing those giants fight it out was probably the best education I could ask for. But also the fact that I was there without a fully formed identity. You know what I mean? I had come through computer science, but I was not wedded to it. You know what I mean? My identity was kind of available, if you will. And so you could say that the rest of my life has been how to absorb that boundary into my own life and make it the core of what I'm doing. You see what I mean? So that the fact that there was a second generation there, and I'm not the only one who had that experience, was also part of the innovation process of having people who are ready to run with that kind of empty space between communities and make it their own core. And since then, forming communities around the topic. So I just wanted to sort of give this both as a kind of neat historical context, but also because I think there is a lot to learn from that experience in terms of context for innovation and so on and so forth. So as I said, I'm going to speak by default, but feel free to join in. This is another little story that I wanted to share with you because the term community of practice is a term that has had a kind of interesting career, but really, in fact, when people ask me, so who are you, where is your identity, I say I'm a social learning theorist, because really the term community of practice is part of a broader theory that has to do with a social perspective on learning. And I was an evening I was invited at a friend's house and for dinner, and he served me a glass of wine. So I know little about wine, but I'm from Switzerland, so I'm polite. And so he asked me, so what do you think? And I said, it's pretty good. For me, it could have been anything. It was okay. And so he leans over the table and says, listen, Etienne, this is a really good bottle. And, I must have looked a bit surprised or something. And so he starts to tell me why, for him, this is a good bottle. And for me, it was like, you know those carvings from the Renaissance where the guy kind of opens the sky and sees another universe behind the firmament or whatever. It was like that. It was like this parallel universe. Because for him, what was an okay glass of wine to me, for him there was this symphony of experiences, like strawberry here and chocolate there and oak here, and then he kind of goes into the kind of trance state with his, and he says, and this one, has a really good purple in the nose. Now, I could imagine that there was strawberry, even though I couldn't taste it myself. But the purple in the nose business, that was beyond my imagination capabilities, Because, not a speaker, a native speaker, I could still claim that I understood purple and nose, but that the wine had purple in the nose, that was really beyond me. And I thought, this is really what our theory is trying to capture, is that there is something about knowing that is an experience of the world. And you may know the words, doesn't mean that you, and actually, it turns out that, because I've used this story a lot, it turns out that since then, what I've learned is that the nose, because my first reaction, in the back of my mind, my thought was, that's true, people who drink a lot of wine tend to have a purple nose. But of course, I didn't say that. But apparently the nose that he was talking about is not your nose, it's the nose of the wine. Apparently a glass of wine has a nose, and it's somewhere in that glass, I don't know. And I even heard since then that a glass of white wine can also have purple in it, even though, at least at the time it was red wine, so there was some purplish color in the glass. So anyway, the point here is that what would a learning theory be that would capture that experience of a being living knowledge as a way of perceiving the world? You know what I mean? And so the words that were used, the purple in the nose, they were almost kind of like an instruction to an experience. And if you didn't have that experience, you could repeat the term, and actually, it's embarrassing to say, but still today, after having used this story many times in my presentations, I still don't know really what it means. You know what I mean? I have stolen that element of their practice to embody it into my practice as a learning theorist, and so the story takes a completely different meaning to me than it has to them, and I still don't really have access to really what the word means. Because if I had wanted to have access to that, I would have had to, drink a lot of wine in the company of people who can take the language. So it would not have been enough for me to drink just wine by myself. I would have to be in the company of people. And slowly, over time, then I could say for myself, yes, this glass has a good purple in the nose, or no, this glass of wine does not have a good purple in the nose. So this relationship between language and experience, to me, was really characteristic of what we try to get at with this notion of a social practice within a specific community. Because for him, the purple in the nose was not something he had invented that evening. It was part of a practice that he was part of a club, and they have these meetings, and they drink wine, and they discuss wine, and so on and so forth. So it was really part of a practice. And in some sense, this table was a boundary encounter at the boundary of that practice, where my friend was opening a window, a kind of vista into his community for me. And it is interesting that he was not trying to be a snob, trying to make me feel stupid. No, he was really inviting me in, but my experience was still an experience of boundary. My experience was still my main experience that evening was, I don't belong there. This is not me. I am not. I know better today who I am not, And then there was that choice of, because I could have asked him, can I join? Can I come on Thursday to your meeting? And I decided not to. And there again, I think the notion of identity then becomes central to the whole question of learning, to the whole question of managing knowledge. It's like, is this me? Is this on my trajectory to go visit that community further than I have? You know what I mean? And so I was using really my identity as a filter into the world, into that landscape of practices, and saying, this one is cute. Because it was really beautiful to hear him talk so poetically about a glass of wine. There was something tempting about it. And yet I looked at my life, I look at what I wanted to do, I look at the 30 years I've left on this planet or so, and I thought, no, this is not for me. I'm going to just remain this tourist. And so what I'm saying is that once you take this seriously, that knowledge exists in the landscape of social practices that are embodied in specific communities, then the question of who you are becomes very central to how much attention you are paying to other things. You know? And people talk about knowledge management, you know, and to me it's like, if you don't have a notion of identity, how are you going to start managing knowledge in an organization? Because people already have, we were talking about email, you know, people already have too much email. You know, do you need another 200 emails in your inbox to share knowledge, kind of like for its own sake? No, you have to have a sense of who you are, of how to pay attention to, of which boundaries to cross and which not to cross, and which communities to belong to and which communities not to belong to. You know, and actually, this is really, to me, the central question of learning in the 21st century is not going to be a question of information. Information is becoming commoditized. Information is no longer the problem. The problem is, where do I belong? Who am I? And I would say that identity, to me, is going to be the central question of the 21st century from a learning standpoint. You know? And of course, I mean, then there is a whole question of, so what does it mean for schools? And I'm not going to go there because this is not the audience, but there is a whole then big question of what does it mean for for university, for institutions of learning. If we cannot assume that learning takes place in these institutions, that learning takes place all over society, in all these communities that exist, and the interactions between communities and the troubles that people, the journey that people make through these communities, then, you know, what are the implications, both for institutions that promote learning, like schools and universities, and for institutions that want to manage learning, like organizations that have to deal with issues like that. So to me, basically, a social theory of learning really has to pay attention to issues of meaning. You know, how do you make meaning of something like purple in the nose? And meaning at multiple levels. Meanings at the level of, do you understand the language? Do you understand the experience that's behind the language? Do you experience what it means to be one of those people? You know? So learning happens at multiple levels of interaction between who you are, your experience, and the world. Because the world is organized in those practices. So you use, in some sense, you could say that the expression purple in the nose is a tool of meaning making that has been developed by a community to communicate efficiently about the experience of the world that this community is about. So really, purple in the nose is a part of a practice, of a social practice, the practice of wine tasting. And it's a tool of meaning making that practice has developed in order to make the core existence in that practice efficient. So from that standpoint, it's also important to remember that these social practices don't float in the ether. They are part of very, you know, flesh and bone communities that have all the complexities of social systems. So if you are a wine taster and you want to, because you can imagine that there was one day when this expression purple in the nose did not exist in that community. Someone brought it in. There was an innovation. And you can imagine that the innovation was not necessarily received with open arms. You know what I mean? What do you mean purple in the nose? You've not been drinking, you've been smoking something. You know what I mean? It's not like a community is necessarily open to any kind of innovation. You have to negotiate your innovation into your own community. You have to say, try it. Drink in that way. You see what I mean? There's all this negotiation of convincing your community that what you're bringing in is actually worth the community adopting. You know? And so for those of you who are scientists, you know that very well. You know what it takes to claim to have produced scientific knowledge. You have to convince your community that the data you're bringing in, the explanation you're bringing in is worth something. Actually, I would say that if you look at the Renaissance, one of the big innovations in the Renaissance is to have made science a community process. If you are an alchemist, it's a very personal process of transforming yourself so that you can transform lead into gold. But if you are a modern scientist, the way that you can claim to have produced knowledge is by making your claim to truth transparent and inspectable by a community of peers who are going to decide as a community what counts as knowledge and what doesn't count as knowledge. And so that transition from a very individual view of the scientific enterprise to a communal view of a scientific enterprise is to me one of the key innovation that has led to what we could call today modern science. And of course, it has to do also with a lot of methods and practices. But these methods and practices are always in the hands of a community that becomes, if you will, the gardener of knowledge. But again, the question of identity is really important, because identity is not just my decisions of, oh, I'm not going to become a wine taster. Part of it is sort of constructing my journey through the world. But part of it is also, is this community going to accept me? You know? So part of it is also your legitimacy, the identity that you have and its legitimacy in that community. So that if you bring purple in the nose as an innovation in that community, and you are a letter writer, a newsletter writer, famous wine taster, and so on and so forth, your ability to influence that community is going to be very different than if it's me, saying, oh, here is a wine that has an interesting electricity in the temple, or something like this. You know what I mean? They're going to say, what? You don't know what you're talking about. Or do you? You know, it's interesting. Another question would be, what if I had said that evening, you're right, great purple in the nose, kind of faked it. You know what I mean? It was interesting. So how long would have lasted in that community until someone would have called me and says, no, you don't know what you're talking about. So what I'm saying is that moving from community to community is an interesting experience of knowing and not knowing, and building an identity that is both the series of decisions you make about what matters to you and the legitimacy that you gain in that process by entering and influencing a variety of communities. And to me, when we start talking about knowledge existing in a social system, these are the elements really that we need to pay attention to. What are the possibilities for meaning making, the tools of meaning making, the practices that exist, the communities that own these practices, and the relationships of identity that individuals develop with relationship to these communities. So just to sort of start by laying out some of the key elements of what I would call a social theory of learning. And I think it's important to say that this is a social theory of learning and not just a theory of social learning. Because some people take this work and say, oh, okay, then we should have kids in groups, because people learn socially. Well, that is true, that can have some advantages, but I think that the view is more profound here. The view is that we are profoundly social beings in our ability to make meaning. And that is true whether we are interacting with others or whether we are by ourselves. Being a hermit in a cave is also a social statement, because the very notion of hermit is something that exists in a social context and that is interpreted, that is meaningful in a social context. So what I'm saying is that it goes beyond simply being a theory of interactions to being a theory of who we are as learners as we travel the world. Okay, so let me see. So here is a summary of these elements of of a social theory. And now a few stories. And I wanted to start with this story because this is to me an interesting community of practice. When we coined that word in '87, the web was, just there was no web yet, but there was email in universities and so on and so forth. But the promise of the web was not really clear. So we were really looking a lot at face-to-face communities. And here is one that we've been studying for about a year. Once a month we have a teleconference with the leader of this community to just get a sense of what it is to be leading a community like this. And this is a community of people who have what is called myeloproliferative disorders. Now, I think there are health specialists here. You may know more about these disorders than I do. But what I understand is that your body kind of produces too much blood. And it's a bit like diabetes. You don't die from the disease, but if you manage your disease well, there's no cure for it, but if you manage your disease well, you can actually live a fairly reasonable life. And so Robert Ton, who was diagnosed with the disease in the mid-90s, and started having email correspondence with a friend of his who had also been diagnosed with this disease and was a physician. And other people heard about this email conversation, says, can we join, And so the conversation became like a lot of CC on email. At that time, America Online was having a program to give listservs to people who had a social enterprise. And so they joined America Online as a listserv. And today, you have about 2,500 people from all around the world having this listserv-based conversation about the disease. And what started very much as a kind of support group, I think has evolved in an interesting way into a community of practice where the practitioners are not professional practitioners. So here we are not talking about a professional practice. We are talking about people who just need each other because they have the disease, and they learn a lot from hearing what do you do when your arm when you have a constant itch on your arm, and they've, for instance, a little practice that has been exchanged on that list is that there are antidepressant medicine that when taken a very, very low dose can actually help with the itching associated with this kind of disease. So very practical nuts and bolts, think like this, to conversations like, what about this JAK2 genetic research? How important is it to us? So these people use each other as learning partners, both to get tricks about the practice, but also to understand how is our practice as patients related to the research that's happening in medical schools on relevant genes for our disease. And so you have now 2,500 people around the world connected to that listserv, very, 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 speaking about technology, very, very basic technology, and yet very, very useful for those people. And Robert says very explicitly, I'm not going to move to a more complex technology for now, because I want those people to just be able to connect to that community in the simplest possible way. So all you need is an email address to belong to this community. You don't need to know how to navigate the web or anything. And yet, and you can imagine that if there are 2,500 people around the world in that community, you can imagine that not all 2,500 people post every day, because that would make the community completely unreadable. So you imagine that lots of people simply read, And yet there are really interesting emails that Robert receives that he said really moved him. Emails like, can you remove so-and-so from the list? So-and-so passed away. But I wanted to let you know, that's my spouse, I wanted to let you know that your community was one of the most meaningful things for him or her. That they would, the first thing in the morning, they would run to the computer and see what has been posted. So here are people who never showed up really, and yet learned a lot. And for them, it was kind of a lifeline to belong to that community. So I think that we can say that the concept of community of practice has evolved from these very local forms of apprenticeship that we were looking at in '87, to things like this that I would not have really foreseen at the time, and yet very meaningful ways that people come together as practitioners. And I think what I wanted to say by showing that is that what is important in bringing a community together is that sense of we can learn from each other. And that's what key, rather than some kind of professional identity that is already pre-made. Okay? So rethinking learning became an identity for the members of that institute that was almost as strong as their, after the first 9 months, as their sort of discipline identity. And certainly for me, that was the case. So a group of people, let's say, just share similar challenges as a way to understand what brings them together. Interact regularly, learn from and with each other. I think that's really important to have both things. So these patients, they learn from each other. What do you do when you have an itch? They learn with each other. What do you think about this JAK2 research? So both processes are at work, and in a process improve their ability to address their challenges. So very, very simple definition that can take a lot of different incarnations. And so another quick story here, because the myeloproliferative disease was a community that kind of sprung up, bottom up, if you will. Someone had the disease, sought others, and so on and so forth. Here is a community that was very intentionally developed by Eli Lilly, a pharmaceutical company in the Midwest, to cross a boundary. So they had acquired a small lab in North Carolina for some ability to do large tests of molecules that the small lab had developed. And as often is the case in these kind of acquisitions, a lot of mistrust between people in headquarters, a very, regulated industry, process-oriented company with a very innovative labs, very soft, innovative culture, and so on and so forth. So a lot of tension between those two entities that resulted in tests being redone when a project was moved to headquarters, and so on, for lots of inefficiencies. And a manager was asked to go to look into this problem, and she had heard about committees of practice, thought, traditionally in that context, if you have an inefficiency like this, what you would do is redesign the handover process. But she thought, well, maybe there is a more interesting approach, is to see if we can build a committee of practice across that boundary, and started to work on that. And with a training in biology herself, even though she was now a manager and not a practitioner biologist, she approached some of her colleagues and talked about communities. And the first reaction was, no, thank you. We are scientists. We don't do community. That's for HR, And yet, as I was saying earlier, convincing her, listen, science is fundamentally a communal process, and the quality of the community can really make a difference to the science. So now they were interested, because they were interested in the quality of the science. That was what kind of motivated them to start thinking about themselves as a community. QB here relates to a milestone moment in the development of that community, is when somebody said, but we are all quantitative biologists. Now, at the time, the notion of quantitative biology was not really well established, but that sense that there is a set of skills we have, which is not the traditional biology of studying cell structure and so on and so forth, but this ability to create reliable tests across time for the effect of certain molecules on certain diseases. That's our set of skills. And so understanding that shared identity moved the discussion from, who are you in headquarters to come tell us what to do, to what is the practice of a quantitative biologist? What do we do? And how do we describe what we do in a way that makes sense across these boundaries. Another thing that they had to do was to look at their community and the social structure of their community, because apparently, pharmaceutical research is a very hierarchical process where you have, senior research scientists who are very famous and know everything. Then you have research assistants and so on and so forth, all the way down to lab technicians who really are just the hands and feet of the process. But it turned out that if you really want to understand why a test doesn't give quite the same results when it is moved to another location, you really have to know what the lab technicians have done, the decisions they made about how to turn the temperature or pour the liquids and so on and so forth. So that community, in order to inspect that practice, also had to look at its social structure and learn the discipline of making sure that the voice of everybody was included in the conversations. So a lot of this social work was key to actually achieving the results that they wanted to achieve. So if we want to summarize that process in a sort of more formal model of what I think a community of practice is about, is that you had to define a domain. So you had to define that shared identity. Okay, we are all quantitative biologists. That gives us a reason to talk to each other, no matter what affiliations we have. We are a community. We have to inspect the quality of social relationships that allow us to communicate and to work together. And then we have this practice. We have to know what is it that we do and how do we describe it to each other in a way that allow us to exchange, to move a test from one location to another. So to me, those are the three basic elements that you would want to consider when you build a community. What are we about? What relationships do we build? Who needs to be at the table? Whose voice needs to be heard, and so on and so forth. So first you define a challenge. You define a question, a learning question, and that's key. Then, and that's why I call this a social discipline of learning. What are we about is an important part of the social discipline of learning that has to do with identity. Who needs to be at the table? Whose voice do we need to have? Is another element of this social discipline of learning that has to do with community. And then what should we do together? How do we learn with each other? Which is the practice element of the social discipline of learning. So a social perspective on developing learning context that has to do not simply with information or with the brain between the ears, but with the sort of social context of a learning process. And then around that, the three basic elements, issues of participation. So why should I be there? Okay, I can do better science. Okay, now you have my attention. So when you are building a community, that's different from a team. A team is like, okay, you, and you're going to go do that. When you're talking about a community, you really have to take very seriously what does participation mean to the participants? What do they get out of it? And how does it connect to who they are? So this whole question of what creates the context for participation is a key element of this social discipline of learning. The other key element that we've found in all successful communities over time is what I call the nurturing stance. So what we found is that in these communities you have some members who go beyond simply participating to caring about the community enough that they are willing to put their energy and their identity into making the community exist. And this woman, even though she was a biologist by training, the first thing she had to do, if she wanted to build that community, was to find a few people in that community who were going to be her allies in making that community exist. I think that herself, she would not have been able to build that community if she had not found some members who were ready to take a nurturing stance towards the very idea of that community and join her in that vision that that community would be a useful thing to have. So here, some key elements inside the community. And then outside the community, more sort of in the organizational context, having enough sponsorship. So the first meeting of that community took place in North Carolina. So there was some investment to make in sort of getting those people to travel and so on and so forth. So her boss agreed to be the sponsor of that community. And by sponsor, I'm explicitly not using the term manage, because the whole notion of sponsoring a community for an executive or for an organization is that you cannot manage it in the same way that you can manage a team or a business unit. It's a relationship of negotiating the usefulness of the community to the organization that is really a back and forth relationship. So the whole role of a sponsor is that you have authority in the organization. That's what makes you a good sponsor. You have power in the organization, and yet that power does not translate into control. So it's a use of power that does not translate into control in the same way that power in hierarchical structures is usually understood. And finally, support. Actually, at that time at Eli Lilly, there was a team of people who were interested in building communities and were providing support. And by support, I mean providing help with logistics, providing help with coaching community leaders with the issues that are associated with the development of communities. So there was an infrastructure that was providing help to people who took a nurturing stance, and to help them have an experience of high value for their time invested. So, I'm presenting this picture so that we have a more complex sense of what has to be in place for the social discipline of learning to actually be realized. How are we doing with time? Okay. So, if we do have that, I would like to spend maybe like 5 minutes at your tables thinking about a community of practice that you know and trying to see, does this model apply? What are the different elements of that community for you? And reflect on your own experience and see whether that model gives you a language to think through the elements of that community. So, just free conversations at your own tables, telling stories about communities you know, and trying to think about them in terms like that.
Just a question on the sizes of communities and when you start needing that person to facilitate it all the time.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Actually, the size is another surprise. I mean, to me that myeloproliferative with 2,500 people is kind of something that I would not have thought about 10 years ago. And yet, when you look at it, when you look at the structure, when you look at the amount of learning that is taking place, and in that case, there is a person, Robert, who is really kind of running the community, but lightly. He's running it very lightly. I asked him, for instance, has there been a time when you had to be really heavy duty in your facilitation? And he said, no, in about 10 years, I had to once send an email to someone that was posting inappropriate things, But it was interesting. There was a little episode that we saw where the community became self-policing. Someone posted something about gender that was kind of off-color. And it was interesting to see how all of a sudden, the community's discussion removed from the topic of the community and focused on the community itself. Is it appropriate for us to have this kind of conversation? So it was interesting to see how, because these people really care about this community, it's really meaningful to them, how they were willing to engage in a nurturing conversation for a while to make sure that their community was protected from inappropriate postings. So my sense is that you have to have this nurturing stance present in the community. Sometimes it's clearly a role of a person who does that, you know, and we call that a coordinator or a convener, depending on how much of the day-to-day running of the community they do. But that has to be present. How distributed it is, how formal it is, will depend on from one community to another. I would say it has to do with the use of time. What is it going to take to create what I call high value for time? To me, that's the key success factor of these communities, is that when they provide high value for time. I invest some time in that community, I get high value from it. And how much work does it take, for instance, to run the website, so that when people hit that website, they feel they get high value for time, you know? How much care does it take to organize a meeting, so that when people come to that meeting and they go away, they say, oh, that was a good investment of my time. If this is what this committee is about, I want more of it. Okay. So in organizations, what we've found is one of the best things that an organization can do for a community is to free up a bit of time from one of the members to act as a nurturer of that community. That's, in terms of investment, that's the single most significant investment an organization can make, you know, because there can be sort of professional support, and I think Debbie is going to talk more about that in her talk, sort of. But that element of nurturing that comes from within the community is a key success factor. Yep.
Okay, so the last two examples you've given both highlight the role of leadership. And in much of what I've heard and read about communities of practice, it's come across as a very organic process. Yet you've clearly underlined that they don't work together without someone somewhere taking the leadership role. And in my experience, there's two dimensions to that. One is purely the organizational dynamics, so the convener of the online discussion. But secondly, there's got to be some intellectual leadership. Having organized a lot of meetings in my life, I've learned very painfully exactly what you just said. There's a success for time, value for time factor in it, and part of that is, you know, how do you put the meeting together to make sure that the people you want to come will go away from it with something of value to them, so that they want to come back when you do it a year again, or 2 years again, or 3 years again down the road. And that doesn't happen without a leadership role. So how do you build the leadership role into this?
And I think that's exactly the point, that why these communities are difficult, because leadership has to account for the organic nature of the thing. So for instance, I think you're right, that without leadership, these things tend to, like for instance online, you know, you find some of these discussions online, they become hostage to people who have too much time on their hands and too many opinions, you know, and it's like, so they move away from practice. The good thing about this myeloproliferative community is that to me it was one example of an online open community that was actually successful, where you read the conversation is very focused on how to be a patient with a disease. And it's not like all these opinions and stuff like this. It's very, very beautifully focused. So, yes, organic does not mean leadership less. But it means that the leadership has to be, I don't want to say light-handed, because sometimes it's very heavy-handed. A friend of mine had recently to kick out somebody from the community to protect the community. But it has to respect that organic nature. It's not the same leadership that it takes to run a team, where you assign tasks, you know. If the community feels that the leadership is kind of like taking over, it de-energizes the community. So it's a kind of enabling leadership that is really of a special kind. And the people who can do that well, I call them social artists. They are, you know, like, they have a lot of respect for me. First of all, because in doing this work, I meet a lot of people who do a kind of social work that I know I couldn't do, you know. You write a book and people think you know everything. But in fact, in fact, the people who are these social artists, who are convening these communities are incredible people, incredible human beings who know how to exercise leadership in a way that gives voice to a community rather than takes the community over. And that's really an art. And I would say that it's an art that's going to be crucial in the 21st century. I think in the 21st century, the key to organizational design in the 21st century is going to be that balance between the formal and the informal. I think that the 20th century has been the history of the formal. We have milked our organizations as much as we could. If you look at the 21st century, 20th century's history of organizational design is reorg after reorg after reorg. We put so much faith in the formal. And I think towards the end of the 20th century, we kind of discovered the informal. That's why the concept of community of practice, I think, has had such a success, is because it was giving a handle on the informal. And so these new forms of leadership, I think, are going to be key in the 21st century, because I think the organizations that are going to be successful in the 21st century are organizations that can tap into these issues of identity, these issues of personal engagement, personal passion, and not simply think that the formal design is where the game is. Yep.
More of a comment, I guess. I love the model because I think all of us can probably see this in various forms in our formal and informal network. I think a couple of quick comments, though, regarding domain and practice. It's been my observation that domain knowledge is critical to sustain these networks. If you're not able to have people inside this network that have domain knowledge and that are lifelong learners in themselves, I think is critically important. And so whenever you're running a network, whether it's formal or informal, your ability to attract people who have that domain knowledge is critical. Yeah. Whether that's the person actually managing a network, right. or chairman of a board or whatever, or board members. That's really important. The second part about I think as well is the whole notion of best practice. Continually trying to evolve and build and learn. All of those two have to be linked, and if they're not, my experience is that the network falls apart. And because then the participation drops off because no one is getting any value out of it because they're not continually learning. So this is like a lifelong learning network in that context.
Absolutely. And I think it's important, speaking about leadership now, to understand. When I talk about leadership in a community, I talk about an ecology of leadership rather than leaders and followers. There are many forms of leadership in a community, and I think domain leadership is one form of leadership. By the way, what we've found is that your world expert in a domain is not necessarily the best person to run the day-to-day work of the community. So I think it's important to distinguish these different forms of leadership. Another form of leadership, by the way, that I think is going to be crucial to the kind of work you are doing is what we call brokering leadership. It's a kind of leadership that's often ignored, but it's the ability to cross a boundary, the ability to be a person who can live in two communities at once and therefore create a link between these communities. Very, very important leadership role that is easy to overlook because it can be so invisible. And speaking of identity, it is often a difficult thing to live as a person. Actually, I was on the committee of a student in Denmark. She did a very beautiful study of a person. She was looking at technical support as her topic, and she took that concept of a broker from my work because she said the best way to describe this person she was looking at in a school who does technical support is to think of that person as a broker between the IT community and the teacher community. But one insight she had, and I told her, just for this insight you deserve a dissertation, you deserve a doctorate, because it's such an important insight. She noticed that, we often think that in our multiple identities, multi-membership, we are a father when we're at home, we're a professor when we're in the university, we are a CEO when we are in our little company. This is the kind of way that we manage our multiple identity? Well, this teacher was doing just the opposite. In order to be a broker between the two communities, when he was with the IT people, he looked like a naive teacher. When he was with his teacher colleagues, he was the IT person who could answer all the questions. So what was interesting about him acting as a broker is that he was flipping his identity the opposite way in order to create that bridge between these two communities. So what I'm saying is that these notions of identity, leadership, boundary, core, all these notions are part of this social perspective on learning.
We're going to time for 2 more comments, and then we'll have a break.
Yeah.
I have a question, and that is how important for the success of the community is the definition of the problem that brings people into the community? I mean, if we're talking about commercialization, it has a range of definitions, some broad, some narrow, and you know, to be inclusive, it has to be broad, but that then may take away the effectiveness of the community.
Okay, now we're talking about these social artists. I think one of the key to the work of these social artists is that they can create a context where people recognize themselves. So this notion of a domain here is really important, and it is important not so much in terms of how precise a definition of it do you have, but do you create a social definition of it that some people will say, yeah, this is me. See what I mean?
So again, it comes down to the leader making that.
Yeah, I mean, and so there are communities that debate very clearly what is our domain. And actually, you know, I would say that in the institute, we debated a lot. What is learning? You know? And who owns it and so on and so forth. So the first 9 months were kind of what is our problem? What brings us together? Who has legitimacy to contribute to that? And who can recognize themselves in the definition of the problem? For the myeloproliferative disease, it's a little easier because, you know, people recognize themselves as patients, although this community could at some point start separating into smaller communities if the treatment for the different diseases in that family became different. But right now, basically, it's one community, you know. But over the life of communities, sometimes they split as the domain become redefined.
If you wants to jump in here.
Yeah.
Well, for me, that begs the question is, does there have to be a problem that you're trying to solve, or can it be a goal that you all have a common goal, or is it an alignment of goals, which may, of course, be the problem. But are we trying to define a goal as opposed to define a problem?
Well, to me, we are trying to define a domain. Okay, this is why I use the term domain very intentionally, because a domain is not just a goal. To me, a goal is a bit too small for a community. Okay, it has to be an area of learning, an area of understanding that corresponds to people's identity. And whether it's defined as a goal, whether it's defined as a challenge, whether it's defined as a set of problems, whether it's defined as a disease. You see what I mean? It's like interesting that here, well, of course there is a goal. I want to live healthily with the disease. But what defines the community is a bit broader than a goal. It's a set of reasons to be together. Because when I hear your story about what you're doing, I learn a lot about what I should be doing. So I've seen communities, and I'm going to sort of briefly tell you the other things that I had prepared, but this conversation is much more important than what I had prepared. So it's really okay not to go through all the slides. I'm willing to entertain questions if some slides trigger your imagination. But like, this is some recent research we did about different forms that these communities take. So some are very oriented towards the context of serving a goal, So you could say that to some extent the QB community was really started by a business problem. There is inefficiency. We waste time and our patent is running out while these two communities are working out their problems. So it was triggered by a business problem, So it was very much oriented toward its context. There are some communities that are much more sort of open-ended conversations. That's how people find their communities. There are communities that find themselves in sort of meeting regularly. There are communities that find themselves because it gives them access to expertise. So for them, sort of I know there's a community at IBM of salespeople. For them, the way that the community is really useful to them is that it's a community that's connected by instant messages. You are with a customer, you have a problem, you send an instant message to your whole community. Whoever is online can help you. So this kind of instant access to expertise is kind of the DNA of that community. So what we found is that different communities have very different kind of DNAs, but they all have that basic model of a domain, a community, and a practice. We have one final question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was telling my children who are 12 and 14 about this meeting yesterday, and they found it very funny. I said, why do you need to spend 1.5 days talking about that?
Yeah.
And I had a very good conversation with them about the fact that we really don't learn from each other as much as we should, and that we are not that keen to participate in communities of practice, and that we don't even use the internet properly. Mm-hmm. How many of you have a Facebook account? 1, 2. How many of you have a MySpace profile? How many of you use Wikipedia? How many of you have contributed to Wikipedia? Okay. Do you know that we are preventing our students from using Wikipedia?
You're preventing your students
Oh,
from...
yeah. That's heresy. I mean, using Wikipedia, oh my God, you understand, that's an unreliable source of information. It's crazy. So my first comment had to do with the generational gap.
Yeah.
For our kids, this is natural. Mm-hmm. For us, it's like pulling teeth. The second is, so how can we bridge the gap? Is there a role for reverse mentorship? Get some of these kids into rooms like this to show us how to do this stuff. The second has to do with commercialization, especially related to research. In a highly competitive environment where there are no incentives for people to learn from each other, learn together, even though we talk a good game. Okay, we talk a good talk. We say, yeah, let's learn from each other, but all our incentives are built for us to compete and to build walls around our institutions.
Yeah, very great. First of all, the other day my wife told me something really interesting. She told me, you know, Etienne, the more I understand what you're doing, the more it seems totally common sense to me, and the less I understand why anybody would want to pay you for this. So I didn't know whether to take this as an insult or a compliment, because the fact that it is intuitive, I think the reason the concept of community of practice has had the success that it has in the last 17 years is because I think people say, yeah, I know that. You know, I mean, it's not an esoteric concept. It's I have had that experience. You know, but it is also true that our organizations have become somewhat counterproductive from the perspective. Is that all that the structures that we have put in place seems to militate against our ability to participate in these forms of knowledge construction. So it is common sense, but common sense seems to be uncommon in many contexts, and so yeah, I think it would be really interesting to explore the generational aspects of this. But I also want to say, you know, these communities have existed since the beginning of humankind. So it's both generational, because I think the technologies that we have give new embodiment to these communities, and it's also fundamentally human, because I think that's the way that human beings have learned from the beginning of time. And of course, you know, some communities are very oriented towards content publishing. Also, another thing I should say about this slide is that these orientations are not mutually exclusive. So, if you think of a community would be almost like a spider. The profile of a community would be almost like a spider representation. If each arrow had a 1 to 10 scale, if you will, you could see a community as a kind of shape. Maybe like the meetings are very important. We don't do any projects, but we build our relationships a lot. Communities that are oriented towards relationships spend a lot of time talking about each other. I know a community that meets once a quarter for a day and a half, and they spend the first 3 or 4 hours telling each other stories about what they've been doing since they last met. So for them, knowing each other, being participant in each other's life is a really important aspect of how they build the kind of trust and mutual commitment that allows them to learn from each other. On websites, you see people having like personal pages on a community space, and you know everything about them, you know, from their dogs to their kids, to their trip to Australia, and so on and so forth. So these are communities that really build strong interpersonal relationships to create an experience of community. Whereas the community that I mentioned yesterday, the salespeople sending an instant message to get a response to some question from a client, they don't care about how many dogs you have. You see what I mean? They want the answer to that question right then. You know. So those are very, very different orientations for these different communities that have implications for the kind of facilitation that it's going to take, and have implications for the kind of technological substrates that are going to be useful. The ones that may not be so obvious projects, a community of mental health professionals could meet only once a year. So during that meeting, what they did was to list the 10 most important issues that needed to be addressed. And they put flip charts all around the room and have people sign up. And basically your connection to your community was that during that year you were going to work on a project with a small subset of the community to address an issue that was important, and come back at the end of that year to report on what you had found to the rest of the community. So for them, doing something together was really sort of almost like the DNA of their community. And it's the reason I'm saying that is to show the very different shapes that those things can take. I mentioned context. That's also a big difference that we've seen between communities. Communities, for instance, that belong to an organization, where for them creating a practice for the organization is an important part of how they experience their community. And the fact that they are all employees of the same employer create a kind of trust that almost comes from the context. We are all committed to making this company competitive. And what it translates into is that, for instance, our document management system has to be compatible with the document management system of the company, but also activities. When we were working with Chrysler, there were communities for whom an important activity was to go look at the brakes of competitors. So as a community activity, they would dismantle the brakes of a competitor and discuss together how Toyota was designing brakes as a way to ensure that their company had a world-class practice in that domain. So for them, that orientation towards the competitiveness of their organization was really central to their experience of community. Individual participation, you see it more now because of multi-membership, because of the fact that most of us are members of more than one community. I was speaking with Elliot Macy the other day. I don't know if you know him, but he's like kind of a learning guru in the US. So yeah, I know what you're talking about. I belong to 40 of those. It's like, wait a minute. 40. So technology has enabled us to actually be lurkers or peripheral participants in many communities. And so managing your individual participation in these communities is very important. So you see now, for instance, technologies that allows you to subscribe to a very, very specific slither of a community. You don't belong to the whole community. You almost belong to a small sub-conversation because you have to manage your participation in individual ways. And so communities have to balance that. For instance, in the community I belong to, now, anytime we have a teleconference, we make a recording of it. There's an MP3 file that goes on the website with the notes from the meeting. That means that If you can't be there, you can, attend at your own time, in your own time. But what that means also is that there's less motivation for the community to really be there during the teleconference. So there's a cost, if you will, to enabling these individual forms of participation and creating a sense of togetherness. And so you see I know a community, basically, and this is a committee of executives who tend to say, oh, I don't have time this time. Basically, the tacit rule of the community, it's not tacit, it's expressed, is you miss 2 meetings and you're out. So for them, they don't want too much individualized participation. They want to create that sense of commitment to each other. So these are tensions that most communities have to live in, and you have to learn to manage that. Because if there is no individualized participation, then people will drop out because they say, oh, I can't commit to that. If there is too much, then it's difficult to have an experience of togetherness. To this model 4, this is not exactly cliques, but this is a form that we've seen across communities, right, where you have a core group of people who really are dedicated to the community. Around that, you have a group of active people who really participate in everything that the community is doing. You have then a band of occasional participants, people who participate whenever the topic suits them or something like this. And then a band of peripheral participants, people who are not really members of the community or full practitioners, but they are interested in a topic, they want to keep in touch with the community. I'm sort of indirectly addressing your question. What we've found is that this is not something that you need to fight if you are the facilitator of that community. This is a natural state of communities where, and that's where a community is very different from a team. I think in a team you don't want to have people who kind of hang out. In a team you want everybody to be dedicated to the task. In a community, having people who kind of hang out is very useful. For instance, if you have VC people who hang out around the technical community, it's really important because then they can provide their service to the community in a much better way. So this sort of peripherality, or lurkers as they are called on the web, actually it's very useful for communities to enable that. But there are reasons to be worried. When you, for instance, if the boundary between the active group, the active and the core group, and occasional and peripheral participant is the difference between Ottawa and the rest of the country. See, if the community is reproducing some kind of boundary that is not natural to the practice, but reproduces something else, So what I'm saying is that subgroups or cliques are not necessarily bad, If you think of a community, especially on the online, people talk about the front channel and the back channel of the community. The front channel being more like the public spaces of the community, if you will, communal spaces, and the back channel being more the interpersonal spaces. They're both important, I remember a community where they were thinking of forbidding email, because they wanted everything about the community to come to the front channel. My sense is, no, the building of relationships is an important part of the building of the whole community. So I think it's a bit like this. If the clique is kind of reproducing something else, if all the guys are becoming a clique, then I would be suspicious of that, But if the clique is a sub-interest of the community, then I think the formation of the clique could be a good strengthening of the community. So I would not bust cliques just as a principle, but I would be careful that the cliques do not represent something else, like gender or being in headquarters or some other kind of foreign element to the community, then I would question it. But, and then another thing that we've learned is that as a social artist or whatever, you have to be really careful what problems you bring to the front channel of the community. In team methodology, basically, if there is a problem, an interpersonal problem, something like this, you try to bring it to the front channel so that the team can deal with it. But a team is also very different from a community in the sense that people are committed to a project together for 6 months or a year. They're willing to spend, 3 or 4 hours solving some interpersonal problem. If you do that with a community where time is so precious, people will feel, I don't have time for this. I'm quitting. So also issues of cliques, issues of interpersonal difficulties and so on and so forth. You have to be very careful how much of that you bring to the front channel and how much of that you just solve by doing back channel work, just a phone conversation with someone, an email and so on and so forth. So also to think at this front channel, back channel aspect of the work of supporting a community. Communities are not that different from conferences, right? If you are a member, if you go to a conference as a member of your company, there are certain things you talk about, and there are certain things you don't. Now, it is true that I have not had experience myself, for instance, with a community of brakes designer across competitors. But I have seen, for instance, communities of CLOs, chief learning officers. Of direct competitors, consulting firm that bid for the exact same request for proposals, and so it's part of the community that you don't talk about the direct competitive things, and people manage their participation in that sense. And sometimes you say things that if your boss was there, he or she might kind of cringe a little bit because there is a kind of citizenship aspect to community, is that you have to contribute enough so that people are willing to contribute back. So, it's not a perfect world, but IP is of course a problem. And other things that we've seen, I think I mentioned that at dinner, I don't remember. When we were working at Chrysler, then the Germans basically, German bosses basically said, no, there will not be cross-Atlantic communities of practice because of liability. We do not want the advice of our German engineers to be involved in lawsuits, in product lawsuits in the US. This slide, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. You can look at it yourself. Well, this slide is an effort I've been making lately to express what I've learned about communities of practice in different models. And this one is learning activities I've seen communities engage in, and I've put them all kind of in one slide, which is a dangerous thing to do, but because you always make compromises. But basically, these activities are put there on a scale of from learning from each other, so giving each other tips. I've learned this in my practice, to learning with each other, a reading group where you use each other as learning partners to read a paper important in your domain. So a range of from learning from to learning with, a range of formal and informal. Often people think about communities as informal structures, but in fact internally they are not. Informal doesn't mean loosey-goosey. So some of these activities that they engage in are quite formal, like for instance mutual benchmark, a community that says, okay, let's look at all the plants in our organization, and why on this measure is this plant so much better than this one? And so the community kind of analyzes the factors and say, how could we bring everybody to the performance of the best? That could be a very, very formal activity organized by the community as a way to learn both from and with each other. And the clusters that I have noted range from exchange. So you exchange documents, you exchange tips, you exchange stories, to what Hubert and Debbie called productive inquiries. That is an inquiry that comes from the practice of a member. You bring a problem to your community. You broadcast an inquiry because you are with a customer and you need to say something, or a case clinic. That is an activity that we've seen many communities engage in, where it's almost like a little consulting session, where a member has a design problem, for instance, and comes to the community and says, "Could we brainstorm this thing? I'm stuck here." So that would be what we would call a case clinic, or you have a new idea, you say, I wonder if this would work. So you bring it to your community, it becomes a debate, and this is done because this is done in the front channel of the community. That means that people can debate each other's responses. So in fact, there's a lot of learning that takes place in these productive inquiries. Because if you broadcast a question and someone answers, when I was with a customer like this, I did this or that, then because it's done in the front channel, people can say, no, I tried that, it didn't work in my case. So these productive inquiries can lead to interesting debates that increase the quality of a response, as opposed to simply a response that would be done on a private email. So anyway, I have found 7 different clusters of activities, from exchanges to these productive inquiries, to building shared understanding, and this rectangle here expresses that some activities are done among the members, some activities are done with others. And let me finish the list, and then you can ask your question. This is more like the production of documents, the production of knowledge assets. This is establishing standards. So when you do mutual benchmark, basically you say, okay, on this measure, it looked like this plant is our standard. And we should see if we can bring all the plants to the performance of this one. So there are different ways of establishing standards. And then formal access to expertise, from training to a very formal process of transferring a practice that was done in one part of an organization into another, through things like peer assist and so on and so forth. And then visits among the members. So if you have a distributing committee, it's a pretty good idea to just go visit people. So if you have a regular meeting of the community, it's a good idea to have that meeting happen at the place of work of different members. Having seen the place of work of someone really makes a difference. It's amazing, a lot of difference when you speak to them on the phone. To just have seen where they work. So sometimes just a visit, but also a visit among communities, taking a field trip to a community, or something that we do regularly are web field trips, where we go visit the website of a community, but we are on the phone with a member of that community who tells us why this website is important, what kind of community experience is expressed by that website. So field trips can be really neat. And then a few companies have organized what they call practice fairs. That is, imagine the entry hall of the World Bank. Very austere, kind of glass and concrete, big space. On the day of a practice fair, it's buzzing with booths. Every community has a little booth, and they expose what they've been doing, and they visit each other. In some cases, they even had an innovation. Speaking about innovation, an innovation booth. So the idea of this innovation booth, it was like a little granting agency, a mini granting agency that had some money to give to people, like 2 members of 2 different communities who had found something important to work on together, could go apply for a mini grant to explore that idea further. Right there in the practice fair. So I think there was an interesting story of the transportation, early childhood, and women issues community coming together to think about taking kids to school in some countries. So interesting little mini project that were born out of this interaction between communities. Yep. Actually, blogs are an interesting development in the online world because they are allowing communities to emerge out of without a clear boundary. It's like a discussion boards tend to have the clear boundary of those who are members and those who are not. But blogs, because of the track back and discussion among blogs, form kind of clusters that are like communities of practice, but in a kind of open fashion, emergent fashion, that is very interesting. And also some communities that are very person-centered, where you have one blog that is really at the core, and then the community forms around a person, which is a new kind of community. So you find these communities everywhere. Actually, for you, there is an interesting community about municipal cultural planning here in Ontario among different municipalities. There is also an interesting report by Alice McGillivray on bioterrorism communities that are formed among scientists of different disciplines, speaking about cross-boundary communities, different disciplines, different departments at the federal level, around issues like chemical weapons, biological, explosive, radiological, and nuclear. So these communities have been formed with some serious money from the federal government to create communities around these topics that bring different disciplines to bear. It's a very interesting project. And of course, Silicon Valley here, there are studies of Silicon Valley that would confirm a lot of what Olaf was saying, where the communities, if you will, are the fabric of the region. And the companies are almost like mushrooms that emerge out of that fabric of interprofessional relationships, as opposed to Route 128, where you had in Boston, where you had a few big companies like IBM and DEC that were kind of owning the practice. And to finish, I'm done. To finish, I think that we have seen three waves in the whole notion of knowledge management. The first wave was really technological. I think that knowledge management really started as a technological enterprise. The second wave was, we discovered people. People have to do something with knowledge. And I think the term community of practice then became very important because it gave a way to for managers to think about knowledge existing in their organization, in these communities, and something to do about it. Instead of managing knowledge for people, we enable these communities to become a place where practitioners themselves become the managers of their own knowledge. I think an important shift. And then I think a third shift that we are seeing now, and I want to conclude with that, is that for some organizations, putting communities in the design is becoming part of the strategy. So that you can see at IBM, for instance, some communities that are taking the lead on some strategic thinking around, like for instance, desktop support, which the company had kind of let go as a not very profitable aspect of the business, and yet these practitioners who are in daily contact with the customers. So this is really an important strategic direction, and actually we're ahead of the company in having the business intelligence of understanding where the strategic direction. So you have the strategy through the domain, the community, and the practice influencing the performance, but then these communities, because they are in touch with the market and with the customers and with competitors in the market, bringing back intelligence into the strategic thinking of the organization. So I think that this third wave is just starting now in some organizations, where it's becoming an explicit part of how the company is starting to think about strategy, involving practitioners in that reflective loop of a community of practice. Okay.
The most important thing that I learned yesterday that really impacted me strongly was it's sort of a reminder, but it's sort of like a light put on it again for the first time in a long time, the criticality of the people element. The fact that the concept of a community of practice depends on communities. It just shows how you can lose focus while you're proceeding. And there was a thinking thing that we did that a community has to have some need to get together. Purpose was also used as a word. And that's the reason they get together. Without that, they're unlikely to condense into a community. In order for there to be a community, there has to be a group of willing and the right people, I guess. So you can't form a community of brake experts with people who are wing experts. So they have to have the right people. And something needs to, it seems, ignite or bring them together into a critical mass. Nuclear weapons is the assembly needs to be there. I think of the explosive for the assembly of this weapon to be someone like Deb. Okay, she came and compressed the thing and made it work. But what was critical is there had to be an initiator. I think of that yesterday. An initiator was Hubert. Who not only initiated it but tamped it, kept it there, kept it together.
Although Hubert played a very specific role of sponsoring the thing. Actually, the initiators, the real initiators, were the agents who came to our workshop and felt like, wow, this is what we need. And when there were a few members who wanted the community, then it happened. But the first 2 times, it didn't work.
Okay, that's interesting. So it couldn't be externally initiated. It had to be internally initiated. It could be.
It can be. The idea can be planted externally. But if the idea is not taken up by a few potential members, it doesn't work.
Okay, excellent. And what I learned too is that in looking at that, there are probably a variety of supports that can be provided related to how to make this happen or help this happen. Obviously, one of the supports is a person, again, with a process, a methodology. This is not something that you can just do randomly. If you want to do it efficiently, you're going to have some reasonable canonical process that you're going to use. And it doesn't have to be super formal, perhaps, but it needs to be structured, it seems to me. And then finally, there might be technologies along the way, my favorite topic, that support each aspect of this. We talked about like a portfolio of reasons to come together, like issues in the company or needs in the company. The people could be brought together through technologies to some extent, although we learned that face-to-face is certainly critical at the beginning. And there may be other aspects of this, like databases of people and expertise that could be drawn upon. So that whole business, what comes out of it is probably, to me, the most critical element is the social, you've used the term, I like the term social artist a lot. The social artist that paints this particular configuration, this particular picture. And, I think that, to me, that's the big message. Other messages that I got from this is the comments that were made at the back table about the layers. The fact that we are looking to create things, but we're not building it on what's been created. So there's an engine there that would maybe even provide resources to make this happen or stimulation to make it happen. So the layering of what is done, particularly in the commercialization community, on what already has succeeded, not abandoning that and moving to the next thing. To me, that seemed like a really, really critical knowledge. And the concept there would be to engage the existing company base somehow in this. And it's interesting because they would know the value of the things that want to be achieved. Another idea, and again, I'm not emphasizing any order of these, is that a lot of these elements, particularly intellectual property and God knows everything else markets, are international. And they cannot be done just within Ontario or a local region. And Ontario cannot be on its own as a message that came out of it. So that whole set of thinking needs to be expanded on. Yet another topic, the problem of language, jargon. And I'd like to use language as more than vocabulary, but also ways of thinking, ways of viewing things. Sort of a little bit of the capture of the culture of different groups. So you know how it is that lawyers are different from researchers, from entrepreneurs, and that each is able to begin to understand the other. In academics, we call this research, we call it transdisciplinary thinking, where I learn your way of thinking and combine it into my mind. And to some degree, it seems in a community that sharing of minds into each other needs to be there. Another topic that came up related to IP is the issue of the IP ownership. There's a little bit of diversity in that, but the strength was on the fact that who owns IP at universities is an issue, and the problem of getting IPs properly funded within the university community, getting them out of the university, is a major challenge. Another concept that goes back to the beginning of people, I like slogans, but I don't always know that they're limited. You can argue with them, but just take them as far. We don't build communities, they build themselves. I thought somebody used that quote. I don't know if you, Deborah, who. Obviously, somebody needs to facilitate that process, but the idea is that you can't do anything to force a community. That became clear in everything everybody said. Someone brought up the idea of skills that are needed in communities, and lots of different skills like collaboration skills and things like that. But one skill that's missing in many of us is the skill of recognizing need and being willing to admit to limitation. And in the concepts we're dealing with, no one person can possibly do the things. So we have to recognize need. But that is an unusual ability because people like to think they're self-contained. A couple of other thoughts is we've got the idea that, just making sure I don't repeat anything here, the business of getting IP out of universities, it was really a lesson to say, I'm in the university and trying to sell, if you want, our capabilities, particularly in our institute. And we have a hard time doing that, even relating to companies where we think companies should be interested. And what I learned was that the companies view the universities as huge reservoirs of content, but the companies cannot get easy access to that. And they go so far as to use, not deliberately perhaps, but the way they found to get it is through co-op students. In other words, it becomes it's a very thin and narrow channel into a world, a huge reservoir. And it seems to me we have a challenge in the academic environments of somehow opening up those channels so that the companies can see what's there, obtain the value, and, without whatever the problems are along the way. And it might be worth investigating that. Final point is I learned today a very important message, and I'll challenge you after this with your comments. I realized finally from Etienne that it was Chrysler who took the brakes off Toyota.